Okay, everybody. Welcome to the Regional Summit on Air Pollution and Asthma in our community. My name is Jim Fabisiak, and today I'm going to be speaking to you about the relationship of air pollution and environmental justice in Southwest Pennsylvania. So first off, I would like to thank the organizers of this meeting for inviting me to talk about this, and as well as thank you for attending and your attention. And so most of what I'm going to talk about today is not going to be particularly relating to asthma per se, although this is an asthma conference, but it will be dealing with air pollution that is in our particular region. And we all know that air pollution is well associated with aggravation and exacerbation of asthma. So the principles that I'm going to outline for some other diseases will certainly be relevant to asthma as well. And so just to point out, as most of you probably are aware, air pollution has been an environmental concern in Pittsburgh for quite some time, largely because of the heyday of the steel industry, heavy industrialization that goes back to the 40s. You can see that picture on the left, which shows downtown Pittsburgh in the morning. Looks like the clock says it's about 8:40 in the morning, but the cars have their headlights on. And you can see the sort of vast amount of pollution that is accumulating there in the downtown area. But although the air has gotten cleaner to some extent, we still have considerable problems in the area. We have numerous point sources, particularly various steel foundries and coke works in the Mon Valley, for example, and also, like any urban center, a fair amount of mobile traffic that consists of diesel exhaust from trucks, buses, railroad cars. It also should be noted that our sort of major transportation hubs run along the river and in river valleys, and therefore under certain meteorological conditions, those pollutants can accumulate in high concentration as well. And so amongst Pittsburgh's claims to fame, to sort of illustrate its issues with air pollution, the American Lung Association annually produces a State of the Air report. Its most recent in 2020 named Pittsburgh metropolitan area as number 16th worst out of about 250 metropolitan areas in the country. For short-term particulate pollution, number 9 worst for long-term particle pollution, and number 35 for ozone pollution. Those little figures off to the right show that under very recent times, 2 dates where this data could be found on airnow.gov. For example, here in March, the Liberty-Clareton area was actually had the worst air quality recorded in the country on that particular day. And this in April shows the poor air quality as shown by the red zone in sort of southern Allegheny County and some other counties there within the area. In 2006, the Asthma and Allergy Foundation voted Pittsburgh number 16 as the most challenging cities to live with asthma. This overall number has improved by the ranking in 2018, but still ranks number 14 for the prevalence and severity of air pollution in the area. We also know that the Pittsburgh region in general, Southwest Pennsylvania, have higher rates of a variety of diseases, cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, and cancer as compared to national averages. And this may or may not have something to do with the amount of air pollution that's present as well. And so one of the main questions is, does air pollution equal adverse health effects? And the data is undeniably yes. So we know that air pollution is associated with overall daily mortality by any cause. So on days of high air pollution, we know that more people die, regardless of what particular cause of death is being considered, but especially things like coronary heart disease, other cardiovascular diseases such as stroke, chronic respiratory diseases such as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or emphysema, asthma, predisposes the lung to various infections, both viral and bacterial. Not so obviously, at least biologically, but we know that in high air pollution can be associated with adverse birth outcomes such as prematurity, low birth weight, lung cancer, and maybe even some neurological syndromes that is being discussed in some of the more recent data coming out. And we certainly know that there's a variety of a wealth of epidemiological studies that essentially speak to this. These are just some examples of relevant studies that looked at particulate matter for a variety of health effects. And so one of the things that will become important is, as we get into this particular talk, the way that we've been able to leverage what the results of these studies are to develop a risk-based model to emphasize or to estimate disease. And so, for example, these epidemiological studies will often publish what we call an effect estimate, which is essentially a relationship between a sort of increase in whatever disease endpoint is being looked at and some unit of air pollution. So this particular study found that for every 10 microgram per meter cubed of PM2.5, there's a 6% increase in all-cause mortality in the study area that was being conducted in. And so these effect estimates are one of the things that can be used to sort of estimate disease burden in a risk-based methodology. It's also important to sort of consider the fact that people are not equitably exposed to air pollution in the areas that they live. So you can kind of appreciate from these pictures down here that there are certainly communities that are located in very close proximity to various point sources, as shown by that factory there. There are also people who live in very close proximity to major highways and exposed to air pollutants that are derived from mobile sources. And in large part, it's not surprising that residents in these particular areas often come from lower income backgrounds, racial minorities, et cetera. And so it's not surprising that we will see that there's a disparate amount of exposure between different groups of people. And this is a study essentially from the National Academy of Sciences that recently estimated that exposure of various demographic groups to air pollutants, considering all of the United States, that Latinx Americans are exposed to about 63% more pollution than they produce. Black Americans about 56%, yet white non-Hispanic Americans are actually exposed to 17% less pollution than they actually produce. So clearly there are racial and economic disparities in the exposure to air pollution. And since we've been able to sort of demonstrate from these epidemiological studies, since exposure to air pollution will have an effect on those diseases that we just mentioned, then those particular classes of Americans will also be predisposed to greater risk from those particular diseases. And this sort of gives rise then to the concept of environmental justice. And so the US EPA has defined environmental justice as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And obviously the past has sort of taught us that this has not really been accomplished very well, because we clearly have those minority and poor populations living close to roadways, living close to point sources, and not having a lot of meaningful dialogue in the policies that actually let those types of changes occur in their neighborhoods. So we can define sort of arbitrarily what an EJ area is. In other words, an area that might be prone to special consideration for these things based on economics and race. An EJ area is basically defined as a census tract or a neighborhood that has greater than 20% of its population that lives in poverty, and or 30% of the population which are a racial non-white minority. And within Allegheny County, there's actually a fair number of environmental justice designated census tracts. So out of a little over 400 census tracts in Allegheny County, about a quarter of those, 25%, would be designated as environmental justice tracts. And as shown on this map, the colored tracts essentially represent those EJ areas. Red is if they are defined by race alone, orange if they are defined by poverty and race, and yellow if they are defined by poverty alone. So one of the sort of questions I'd like you to sort of think about as we begin this, and if I were talking to you in person, I would probably ask for some answers from the audience, but since I'm not, I would sort of pose the question to you, at least to sort of think about, is how many people do you think die prematurely as the result of air pollution in Allegheny County? And it's interesting, when I ask this particular question to some of the students in the courses that I teach, I get answers that range from in the double digits to in the thousands. So I think that you can appreciate that that's not necessarily an easy question to answer. I think we can all agree that it's an important question to try to answer. And I'm going to attempt to do that in some of the work that I'm going to show you coming. And just to make it a little bit easier, not to consider all of those diseases that we talked about early on, but at least one of those to sort of show a proof of principle and the fact that we can even do this type of exercise. So we will just simply talk about one disease in particular, and that's coronary heart disease. In other words, dying or being hospitalized from a common heart attack, myocardial infarction. And just to give you some sort of background data for that, approximately 1.2 million people live in Allegheny County. And in the county, about 188 per 100,000 people die of coronary heart disease each year. In total, that's about 2,295 heart attacks per year. Now, bear in mind that those represent heart attacks by all causes. So if you were out shoveling snow and that was the sort of stimulus that led to your heart attack, and any of the other causes. But we really don't know in what percentage of those that have heart attacks have a heart attack that day because of air pollution. And that's what we're going to try to estimate here. So one would sort of normally do one of those types of epidemiological studies that I talked about that had been done in the past. They're sort of the gold standard. So we could measure air pollution throughout Allegheny County, count the number of people that have heart attacks over a long period of time, and we might be able to come up with some estimation. But there's some disadvantages to that. So as I kind of already alluded to, these types of studies usually require a very long time and or a very large population to see an effect. So you could take a very common disease like coronary heart disease, of which perhaps only a small portion of those are necessarily the result of exposure to air pollution. In order to see that small signal amongst that larger noise of non-air pollution induced heart attacks, takes a lot of people and a lot of statistical power, for example. It also requires that you have sufficient access to individualized patient health records over the duration of the study, knowing where those people live, especially if we are going to sort of pay attention to whether or not these patients, these cases come from environmental justice areas or non-environmental justice areas. And that issue of space is also important because most of those epidemiological studies that have been done are referred to as time series studies, where the pollution in an area, for example, in Allegheny County, would be approximated on a temporal basis. In other words, there are days of high air pollution, there are days of low air pollution. And then the number of heart attacks or emergency room visits or whatever endpoint you're interested in gets tallied for that particular day. And then an association is made. But we don't have very good estimates of exposure, which are resolved spatially. So at the neighborhood level, at those EJ and non-EJ tracks. However, what we're going to try to do is, as I already mentioned, those epidemiological studies do provide those quantitative effect estimates that can be applied to model various disease burdens. And the epidemiological study that we've used for our risk-based estimate is essentially listed here by Michael Brower's group in Vancouver in British Columbia. Was looking at the same air pollutants that we ended up looking at, was looking at the same health effect that we were looking at. And so our goals are essentially to develop a risk-based model where communities could estimate the impact of air pollution on a particular disease within their population without having to conduct that very time-consuming, laborious health impact study. And so we are going to leverage existing spatially resolved exposure estimates. So if you have an exposure map, so to speak, over the community of interest, coupling that with those effect estimates that come from other epidemiological studies, then one can begin to build a model of estimating that risk. So as I said, we'll use the model particularly focusing on coronary heart disease, mortality, and hospitalization. And determine whether those risks are equitably distributed across various racial, economic, and other demographic groups. In other words, comparing environmental justice areas to non-environmental justice areas. And so this basically shows that first step in the model where we are able to obtain a high spatially resolved exposure map to various pollutants. And here we show two particular pollutants, black carbon, which is a surrogate for particulate matter that is generated primarily from combustion. So this comes from both stationary point sources as well as mobile sources. And nitrogen dioxide, which is a gaseous air pollutant primarily derived from traffic related pollution. And so we've obtained these maps in collaboration with our colleagues at CMU. Albert Presto, for example, has developed these land use regression maps, highly spatially resolved. So there's actually an exposure value for every 50 by 50 meter square within Allegheny County for each of these particular pollutants. White means high pollution, black means low. And we are able to then take these estimates and essentially develop an exposure metric for every census tract that is in Allegheny County. And so this basically shows a sort of a heat map that looks at those census tracts that are in the lowest quartile of exposure. So the dark green represent the 25% of the census tracts that have the lowest air pollution. The red shows the 25% of those census tracts that have the highest pollution for each of these two respective pollutants, and intermediate with the light green and the orange for the second quartile and the third quartile of exposure. And so we're beginning to look at what the distribution of environmental justice census tracts are within the range of black carbon and NO2 exposure in Allegheny County. So we have essentially ranked all 400 of the census tracts that are in Allegheny County from low to high in terms of their black carbon exposure metric and their nitrogen dioxide exposure metric. And then in red, we have indicated where each of those, whether or not it's a census tract is characterized as an environmental justice tract. So anytime you see a red bar, that tract meets the criteria for an environmental justice tract, and a black bar does not. And you can visually see that they are likely skewed to the right. The areas of higher exposure seem to have a greater number of environmental justice tracts represented in them. But we're actually able to quantify that from the point of view of essentially taking these 400 census tracts and again, developing quartiles of exposure. So you can go 0 to 100 is the first quartile, 100 to 200 the second, all the way up to the fourth quartile. And then ask the question, what's the relative incidence of an EJ tract to occur in either of the sort of second, third, or fourth quartile relative to the incidence of EJ tracts in the lowest quartile. And so we can routinely arbitrarily set the value in the quartile as 1. The ratio of the EJ tracts here is going to be equal to the number 1. But we can see that as we progressively go up, there are increased EJ tracts represented in the quartiles of exposure, a fairly good dose response, so to speak. But basically at the highest quartile of exposure for black carbon, there are 4 times as many EJ tracts as there are in the lowest quartile. And it's even more dramatic for NO2, where there is almost 20-fold more EJ tracts represented in the highest quartile of exposure compared to the lowest. And this is a sort of complicated slide, but I won't spend too much time on it, but it's essentially how we develop that risk-based model. We essentially have sort of here all of the census tracts from Allegheny County. I'm showing you this model for just mortality from black carbon, but you can essentially do the same principles for the other pollutant, nitrogen dioxide, or for hospitalizations from coronary heart disease by simply some of the sort of constant numbers in the calculation would change, but the principles would essentially hold true. So what we did here was we knew what the sort of overall rate of coronary heart disease was in Allegheny County. I said earlier, that's about 188 per 100,000 people. That gives a risk number associated with that. We arbitrarily assigned, since this represents the whole population, we just needed a starting point. So we took this particular risk value and assigned it to the midpoint of the population, sort of an average exposure, for example. And so that represents that census tract right there, and has an exposure value of 0.997. 50% of the population lives this way, 50% of the population lives this way. And so This particular risk, again, to point out, contains death by coronary heart disease from all causes, not just air pollution. The question then becomes, what percentage of these deaths are due to air pollution? And so we can't really tell that until we at least make the assumption that, remember from those epidemiological studies that gave a health effect estimate, essentially that study that I showed you would say that there's a 6% increase in coronary heart disease death for every 7.52 micrograms of black carbon. And so we have exposure, we have black carbon exposure this way. And if we set this essentially at the midpoint, we can adjust the risk upward as the pollution increases this way as a function of that number right there, or decrease the risk as we go this way. And that decrease in risk or increase in risk is essentially relative to this midpoint. And so now we know, since we have these increases, we set this point to 0. And now we know that this risk to the right is the risk of dying as the result of dying from coronary heart disease as a result of air pollution. And to the left, since pollution is lower in these particular quadrants, the risk is actually going down. Now, those risks are actually relative to this midpoint. And we want to ask the question, okay, what is the risk from all of the air pollution that might be present in Allegheny County? And so we essentially just kind of readjust the baseline and put our 0 point at the lowest exposed census tract. So we're talking about excess deaths that are due to pollution in excess of what is in the lowest exposed census tract. Not all air pollution in general, there's still some air pollution that's represented here, but relative to the lowest exposed census tract. So that gives us a distribution of risk values for each of these census tracts. These risk values can now be normalized to the population number in every one of those census tracts, which we can get from the US Census Bureau. The bottom line is, if we tally this whole thing up, we would estimate that for black carbon alone, in excess of what is present in the lowest exposed census tracts, that's about almost 50 coronary heart disease deaths per year. And about that represents about 2% of all of the coronary heart disease mortality. Now remember, this is just black carbon. We can also do this for NO2 and get additional cases added on that way. This just shows the distribution of those risk values in all of the non-EJ tracts compared to the EJ tracts, whether we are looking at risk of mortality from black carbon, risk of hospitalization from black carbon, and risk of mortality from NO2. In the study by Gann et al., they actually did not find an effect of NO2 on hospitalization. So we did not include that as part of our calculation. But basically, it sort of, you can also see that the risk values that get calculated in general look pretty similar, but you could sort of look at this by saying that at least half of the EJ tracts have a risk value that is equal to or greater than what is only in the top 25% of the non-EJ tracts. So all of these numbers are statistically significant difference between non-EJ and EJ groups. And it's even more profound here for NO2, where almost 75% of the tracts in the environmental justice characterization are greater than or equal to the top 25% of non-EJ tracts. So again, another demonstration of a disparity in exposure. And if we sort of add these coronary heart disease deaths up from black carbon and NO2, coronary heart disease death burden from black carbon is about 38% for the entire county represented in EJ tracts, 41% for NO2. Yet the population distribution, these EJ tracts only represent about almost 25% or a quarter of the population in Allegheny County. So you can kind of say that a quarter of the population represented in those EJ tracts is actually experiencing about 40% of the entire risk from air pollution. So in summary and conclusions, at least for this particular part of the talk, regions predominated by people of color and poverty are disproportionately represented in areas of high exposure to those traffic-related air pollutants, black carbon and NO2. Assuming the risk-based estimates of disease are additive, then together NO2 and black carbon would account for about 4% of the total annual mortality, or about 100 excess cases of coronary heart disease deaths per year. And EJ communities bear approximately 40% of that burden, yet they represent only about 25% of the population. So this just kind of shows where those high priority areas might be. Those census tracts listed in green are actually environmental justice tracts that are represented within the top quartile or 25% of the exposure continuum for either black carbon or for NO2. And just for the sake of comparison, we've also put on the major industrial sources of the two pollutants and an approximation of how much they release per year to at least begin to address whether or not there might be a relationship to stationary point source pollution like factories, or something like proximity to mobile sources. And here you don't see a very good relationship between where the green areas are and where the point sources are. And that's because NO2 is primarily a mobile source pollutant, comes from diesel exhaust, diesel buses, diesel trucks, cars, et cetera. And that's really the major contributor of pollution of that particular pollutant in Allegheny County. There could be a little bit more of a relationship between the black carbon and industrial sources, especially down here in the Mon Valley. You can see some other red dots that are associated with green areas as well. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides about some of the more recent work that we've been doing, shifting the focus from coronary heart disease to lung cancer. And to sort of set some background, lung cancer incidence is clearly related to air pollution. In our mind, we know that lung cancer incidences in general are increased about 30 to 50% in areas of high air pollution compared to areas of lower air pollution. Air pollution is probably the third leading risk factor for lung cancer after smoking and radon. So clearly most lung cancer is due to smoking, but there are people who don't smoke who do get lung cancer. And so we feel air pollution is probably the third leading risk factor. Many occupational epidemiological studies have noted a clear relationship between different air pollutants, in particular diesel exhaust is one of those, but also other fossil fuel combustion products. And also, we can't think of these factors, these risk factors in isolation, because air pollution likely synergizes the effect of other known risk factors. So we know that cigarette smoking amplifies and synergizes the effect of asbestos, as well as radon, in producing lung cancer. So there's also then no reason to assume that air pollution and smoking might also synergize in that effect. So in a paper in a report we published some time ago, we determined that diesel particulate matter is the leading driver of cancer risk among all the hazardous air pollutants in Allegheny County. And this data is actually taken from the US EPA's periodic National Air Toxics Assessment, which looks at the sort of 250 so odd hazardous air pollutants, which are characterized as such by the EPA, estimates their concentration, again, at the census tract level, and then can make some statements about the risk. And about a third of those hazardous air pollutants are indeed carcinogenic. And so one can estimate the cancer risk associated with those exposures. And you can see here that the top 10 or top 11 cancer drivers in the Southwest Pennsylvania county area is shown by this map. So here's Allegheny County in the middle, but also all the surrounding counties. Diesel particulate matter is by far and away has the highest cancer risk associated with it. And this is obviously averaged throughout the whole 10 county area, but you can see that there's a distribution in rural areas. That exposure is much less. Urban areas, the exposure goes up, and even some particular hotspots in those urban areas where the cancer risk values can actually be quite high. But clearly, diesel particulate matter, almost 100 cases in a million over a lifetime, as opposed to the second leading driver of formaldehyde, which is only about 16. Again, we demonstrate diesel exhaust exposure is an environmental justice issue. So the same sort of tack that we took before, taking all 400 census tracts, ranking them low to high in terms of diesel particulate matter exposure. We again can see that there's a disparate localization of the EJ tracts towards the areas of high exposure. And again, quantifying that, we can say that there's about 20-fold more EJ tracts represented in the highest quartile of exposure compared to the lowest. So again, we have disparate exposure. And we know that the estimated risk that would be associated with that exposure is actually very similar to what we see for that same risk from coronary heart disease. So that about 37% of the total cancer risk as posed by hazardous air pollutants in Allegheny County is borne by, again, about 25% or a quarter of the population that are living in those EJ tracts. So these are basically estimated risks. We are beginning to sort of address this and actually looking at rates of cancer and counting the disease, so to speak. And this is some data that was put together by a student at Pitt School of Medicine, Allie Hyman, and Catherine DeMonalis from the Pittsburgh Cancer Institute. So if we look at the Pennsylvania Cancer Registry and focus primarily on lung cancer, in 4 counties in the area: Allegheny County, Beaver County, Washington County, Westmoreland County, and essentially look at the standard incidence ratio of lung cancer. And this is being normalized to the state average for lung cancer. And it's divided by all sex, male and female, but more importantly, divided by whether those cases lived in EJ tracts or in non-EJ tracts. And the easiest way to sort of read this graph is anytime you see a red bar, that incidence of lung cancer is elevated compared to the state average. So we can see that all 4 of these counties will frequently have elevated rates of lung cancer compared to what one sees in other areas of Pennsylvania. And the bar here with the star represent differences between EJ and non-EJ tracts. So here in Allegheny County, lung cancer is greater in EJ tracts compared to non-EJ tracts, whether you consider that by all sexes, male or female. Similarly, in Beaver County, you can actually see some even greater differences between lung cancer in all sex, almost twice as high as the state average, and that is greater than what one sees in non-EJ tracts from that same county. So we are also beginning to see that there's a disparate incidence of that disease as well, which is in keeping with the differences we are seeing based on the risk-based model. So that's really all that I have to say at this point in time. I just wanted to put this last slide on to sort of thank the people who were responsible for doing much of that work on coronary heart disease and environmental justice and NO2 and black carbon. So as I said, Albert Presto, my colleague from CMU, was instrumental in establishing those land use regression exposure maps that essentially allowed us to obtain an exposure metric in the various areas throughout Allegheny County. Erica Jackson was a student in my laboratory for a while who actually did the bulk of the sort of calculations and work and data accumulation that led to that paper. And I'd also like to give a shout out to Dr. Luann Brink, who is an epidemiologist at the County Health Department, who essentially provided us some of those basic statistics that allowed us to at least input the sort of basal coronary heart disease death rate, hospitalization rate to develop our risk-based model. So thank you for your attention, and thanks.